So while we very basically quickly covered Athena being the patron god to Athens, okay, we have multiple other gods, of course, in the Greek pantheon, okay? Of course, the Greek religion was known as the pantheon. Today it is known as Greek mythology. Originally there were the primordial gods that came before these gods, okay? And these primordial gods eventually were overthrown by a group of people, or other gods, called the Titans, which were these giant, massive gods the size of almost mountains themselves. And that eventually these Titans had their servants, the Olympians, the Olympic gods, kind of serving them. Well, eventually Zeus, the most powerful of these Olympic gods, or the Olympians, rose up against the Titans and led the others against the Titans and defeated them. So you end up having the Titans overthrowing the primordial gods with the help of Zeus and some of the others, and then eventually the Olympians decide we're done with the Titans and we want to rise up and overthrow them. And so that's exactly what happens. Many of the Greek gods, there are many of them, okay? There are literally dozens of them, but the most powerful 12 are called the 12 Olympians, okay? The 12 Olympians rule anything from the sky, the sea, the earth, the underworld, with a ton of other minor ones below. We've got Zeus, who is the king of the gods. He's kind of their patriarch. He is the god of thunder and lightning in the sky. He has a brother, Hades, who's the god of the underworld. And there's two underworlds in their mythology. One which is the good underworld, okay, which is nice and happy. And then there's the bad underworld, which is kind of fiery and you're tormented for the rest of your life. There's Poseidon, which is another brother, which is the god of the sea or the ocean. There's, of course, their sister and Zeus's wife, yes, sister and wife at the same time, is Hera. She's a god of multiple different things. She's typically portrayed as a villain in many of the mythological different ideas. But then again, sometimes all of them are villainous in different ways. You don't want to piss off a god, is basically the idea. Aphrodite is the goddess of love and is one of Zeus's daughters. Apollo is one of his sons and is the god of the sun. Ares is the god of war. Hermes, the god of messaging and trips and travel. He had the little wings on his feet, on his sandals. He is the one that was defaced in the Alcibiades scandal, if you recall, from the Peloponnesian War. Artemis is a huntress. Her sister Athena is a warrior god, but not quite the same as Ares. We have Demeter, who is more about, she is all about planting and harvesting wheat. We have Dionysus, god of wine and grapes and the vine in general. In fact, we have, and then Hephaestus is the god of the forge, making things out of metal and building things. And all of them have basically been celebrated in many different forms, as well as a Roman version later on by the Roman Empire and the Roman Republic in Italy. And so they kind of took the same ideas. It's very interesting to see, kind of look at each of the gods and look at the different flaws and ideas behind each one and stuff, but we really unfortunately don't have time in a course like this. If you're interested in Greek mythology, though, by all means look it up. It is definitely worth reading about at times. So pretty good stories out of them. Main moral of the story is don't piss them off. Moving on, let's talk about history. So, history originally was just told from person to person. It was never really written down. We already talked about that with Homer. Remember, he told stories about the Iliad and the Odyssey. He was one of the first people to get those stories and compile them into the big story. But he never even wrote them down, because you would just always tell the next person the story, and they would tell the story again. And eventually those stories would get sometimes out of hand. Sometimes they would stay relatively correct, but sometimes they would change. Some people wrote them down. The Egyptians wrote down tons of history. The Greeks, it took a while for them to write things down. Eventually, Herodotus started to do so. He is known as the father of history because of some of the different ideas that he came up with, such as going around and interviewing people that had actually been to historical places and to different areas and witnessed historical events. And so that is his use of sources, not just stories. Unfortunately, some of those people that he used as sources were either making it up or had their facts wrong based on someone else's story that told them, and that the story gets changed. And so sometimes the stories that Herodotus takes as true are very far-fetched, and we'll get to one of those in a minute. Actually, two. But first, let's talk about the first major source that he did as the father of history, okay? And that is the histories. He wrote the histories, as they are called. They are the historical context of the Greco-Persian Wars. And it talks about the Ionian Revolt. He talks about how Sparta didn't want to help out. He talks about how Athens and Eretria went over to help out, and then kind of, once they won over in Asia Minor, that just came back to Greece without really finishing the job. He talks about the Persian revenge and attacks at Battle of Marathon, where the Athenians won. He tells of all of that story. He also tells of the story of Thermopylae, with the 300 Spartans, as well as all the other Greeks fighting. He tells of all of that story. He talks about the Battle of Salamis, all of that war, the Greco-Persian Wars. We know it thanks to him, as well as other historical archaeological evidence afterwards, and other written down things that we've found since as well. But the main story is in context thanks to him. Unfortunately, some of his later works and other works that he's written are quite far-fetched. He would go around and travel around Greece and interview people between the the 430s to 440s, as well as the 420, as late as the 420s, right before he died, asking about what people saw in other places in the world. One of the stories he heard was that there were ants in India. Ants, like tiny little ants that we have today, okay, that crawl around in the soil. These ones, however, in India were the size of small foxes, or small dogs, and they loved gold. And they would be able to smell gold somehow, and they would go and find gold and dig it up, and bring it back to their nests, which were probably giant, and hide it in their nests, all the gold. So if you needed to find gold in India, the best way to do it was to find an ant. And so, is that true? No, that's not true. None of that is true. Definitely not fox-sized ants, definitely not ones that were able to smell gold and dug it and brought it back to their homes. Like, that's just not true. But he thought the person he was interviewing was telling him the truth. He had no evidence to tell him otherwise. And so he wrote it down and is like, okay. And so he interviews another person, and they tell a similar far-fetched story. And he wrote that down. So some of his work is not necessarily historical. Another one of these tales that he wrote down is of this bird, that when it died, it would burst into fire and then come back to life. That's the story of the phoenix. If you know anything about Harry Potter, or ancient Greek history, or other mythology, phoenixes are around in tons of different things. That's the phoenix. That's the story of the phoenix. And it's very interesting that you've got that story told originally to Herodotus. That is the earliest time ever that we have evidence of the phoenix story, where this bird dies and then bursts into fire to becomes a new bird, baby bird, hatches from the carcass of the fiery body of the other one. That's the story of the phoenix, where it just rebirths and comes back to life from fire. And so it's very interesting that things like myth that we have in pop culture today started because of Herodotus. Getting, again, interviews from people that were either purposely pulling his leg and joking with him to see what he would write down, or they thought it was true because someone had told them. We don't really know. Either way, that's what we get in Herodotus' other history books, other than just the histories, which is pretty legitimate and has checked out with archaeological evidence. Thucydides is another historian that that we'll talk about very quickly. He lived in the period 460 to 400 BCE, so around the same period, but he lived about 20 years longer, and he was born 20 or so years after Herodotus was born. Thucydides actually also used sources. He was actually more factual than his works than Herodotus, because he wouldn't just take one story from one person and count it as true. He would actually not write it down until he heard it multiple times from multiple people. So if he was interviewing a person and they said about gold digging ants, he wouldn't write it down and put it in his book. He would go, okay, I'll remember that one, and if I hear it again, then I'll write it down, is the kind of idea. So we actually do have a lot more facts from Thucydides than Herodotus. He had also a lot of political realism. He talked a lot about politics in his history books and his history works. And then he also talks about the war between Athens and Sparta, the history of the war between Athens and Sparta. He never names it the Peloponnesian War, but it is exactly the Peloponnesian War that I told you all about, with Alcibiades and Nicias and Pericles dying from disease. He tells of all of that. Thucydides does. Other sources also tell about that. Archaeological evidence as well as written evidence from other historians and other scholars at the time, and philosophers. But Thucydides never mentions the war by name. He never calls it the Peloponnesian War. He, however, does talk all about it and gives us the entire history of it. So it's quite interesting. So, and these ideas of using sources is something that we still use, that historians still use. Any book you see that's a history book, it has tons of sources. That's why I ask you for homework on sources. Because if you do history, you can't just say, that's what I heard. You need to at least state how you found that history, okay? Moving on. Sculpture. So let's talk a little bit about sculpture. The different sculptures that the Greeks did was very different than anything that ever came before, okay? And that's one of the very important things to note in this, is that the sculpture of the Greeks was very realistic, and it finally glorified the human body. If we look back to some of the past slideshows and videos that I've done with the Assyrians and the Persians and things like that, you kind of have these sculptures of people in the wall, or the Egyptians. They're not very athletic-looking people now, are they? Okay, they're just kind of a stick figure, sometimes maybe with a little bit of muscle here and there, but not exactly correct. Well, the Greeks wanted the exact style body that athletes and people had at the time, and almost always they were always copying off an athlete. And so you end up having a discus thrower here, where the naked body is exactly, muscle for muscle, exactly the way that discus thrower is about to throw this big giant stone frisbee, or metal frisbee, for the Olympics. He looks exactly like it. That is the exact same pose that a discus thrower would look like. And the muscles were doing exactly it, because they would watch a person do that over and over again while sculpting. The Greeks were very proud of their athletic bodies, and proud of bodies in general. Apollo, one of the gods of the sun, or the god of the sun, very athletic, always pictured as very pretty and handsome, okay? We have Diana, one of the goddesses, okay? She was a god of hunting and things like that, and the god of moon, one of the gods of the moon. And she is with a deer, and the deer itself, the pose of the deer, you can see the muscles in the deer. She herself is about to take a arrow out of her quiver for her bow or an arrow. And so you end up having this very, very pretty version of sculpture carved out of marble or clay or whatever, okay, during this period. Much of these styles, okay, were copied by the Renaissance artists in the 1500s and 1600s in Europe, only 500 years ago from today, okay? And people still sometimes sculpt and draw bodies and things like this because it's very natural looking. It looks correct, right? Even though sometimes it might be the most peak human physical condition, right? But it looks correct, Okay, and so Michelangelo and other Renaissance artists would end up doing very much the same thing. I'm going to pause here and let you end up watching the death of Socrates as we enter the philosophy period, and I'm going to hand it over to Steve Martin for a few minutes.